sign to town, and she did this. And I asked her, I said to her, but I thought it was this sign, and she said, definitely not. This is the sign to town. And a few months later, after me chopping away at this particular work, it's carved out of wood, I had a big block I was chipping away at, and I was about 3/4 way full. And her children came to visit, and they said, no, Mommy, that is not the sign to town, and you can actually get into a lot of trouble.
We're in the studio of Susan Woolf, anthropologist, sociologist, artist, sculptor, wife, mother, grandmother. Susan's works have been exhibited around the world. Even the Museum of Modern Art has purchased one of her paintings, one of her drawings. Susan, it's wonderful to be here, and we're surrounded by the most incredible objects that I hope we can get through to talk about. But I want to start the conversation with your doctoral thesis, which was on taxi hand signs, the way that commuters signal or communicate with a taxi driver of their intention. And also, one of your big projects, how you've developed these signals for the blind.
Well, David, when I first saw people doing taxi hand signs in Louis Botha Avenue, and I realized there's something going on, that was like a defining moment when I realized that I wanted to do this as an arts project.
Why an arts project, and why not just a sociological project or anthropological? I can't get the right word.
Anthropological project, yes. Because all of my projects were art projects, and although my art has been very anthropological, I didn't even realize, to me it was always just art. You know, I've done the hostel crisis in the 1980s, low-cost housing, all these kind of subjects which were anthropological in a way, but to me they were just art. So I started it as an arts project, and I knew that it was something very interesting when I started. And at the beginning it was just like, where do they go to and how many signs there are. And later on, as I went along, I started realizing that there were meanings behind the signs, and that there were many more signs than I realized, and that millions of people were doing taxi hand signs every day to communicate to taxi drivers where they wanted to go.
How did this develop?
Well,
how does a language like this develop?
Yeah.
And how is it passed on? How is it understood by the taxi drivers? And how do the people who use it, the commuters, actually learn it as well?
Well, it starts off, I think, out of necessity, because transport was just so difficult for people. So one doesn't really know exactly who invented taxi hand signs and how it started, whether it was a taxi driver or a commuter. But somehow taxi drivers and commuters were very imaginative, and they started off doing taxi signs, and it caught on. And taxi signs are like area specific now. If a taxi driver is starting a new route, he will, not always, but very often discuss it with the commuters and tell people who are taking that route what that sign is going to be. That's why you find more than one sign, for example, like this sign to Randburg, would also be to other places, because it's not been documented anywhere except for my little taxi hand sign book, which I did in 2007.
Your taxi handbook today, your dictionary, is now a doctoral thesis. It's a huge piece of work. When you say each area has got their own hand signals, so around the country there'll be different kinds of signals that people use to communicate.
Yes, and some of them are site-specific, like for example Dipsloot. We'll talk about what the area looks like. It's kind of bumpy and over a bridge. And others actually have narratives that go with the signs.
Share some of those with us. I mean, we're in Sandton now, in the posh suburbs of Sandton, and if we want to get to call it town, if we want to go into the middle of town.
Town is the most basic one that everybody knows, and I think going to town, everybody uses this sign. And from town to the suburbs is usually down, pointing down, and this would be local. So those are the more common ones that have developed. But then you've got ones like Kliptown, for example, and Kliptown is that sign.
This is, say that again, show that again.
It does that.
Oh, so you use both hands.
You use both hands, and it's actually a social commentary on the state of Kliptown itself.
Explain that. 'Cause
Right,
just,
so
when you-
Kliptown has got the actual township has got a very big rubbish dump on the outskirts right on the outside of the township. So people say it smells and slow down. So it's actually quite important because it's a social commentary about how they live.
What happens if you're signaling Kliptown and the taxi driver is not going to Kliptown? He just bypasses you.
No, but the one who is going to Kliptown will usually hoot to get your attention, and he'll see your sign and he'll stop. So the taxi drivers won't stop if it's not for their particular sign.
Do you think that this is part of the African culture, that they're much more expressive, that they're much more colourful in the way that they actually talk and communicate with each other?
Yes, I think that they are very imaginative. And look, most people only know the 2 or 3 or 4 signs that they use to go to different areas. But you know, some of the signs are really wonderful. Like, for example, this sign which they do in Pretoria mostly, it's a signal to the taxi driver, I haven't got very much money, but can I get a lift? And the taxi drivers call this petrol money, because they can basically give a person a lift if they've got space. So if they don't get as much money, it's worth it for them.
Your big project's also with the blind.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, it's a remarkable project that you've actually undertaken to develop a dictionary for the blind and enabling them to communicate.
Yes.
Can you? I think hopefully we're going to get some visuals, but if you can explain why you did that as well and what you went through to produce it.
You know, the language for the blind was very, very easy to design, and I was quite surprised that it actually became something special in the end, because it became something I really want to work with in the future as well. I also came to realize that a lot of blind people do use the taxi hand signs, and I thought it would be very inclusive to design a language which was a tactile shape language for blind people, not braille, just shapes that combine to make taxi hand signs for the blind. And I developed this language working with SA Taxi and working with SA Blind, and also working with 2 blind people to make sure that they could read the signs as well that I had designed. And it just became a book. This is the book that it actually became, and it's basically 13 shapes that combine.
And it's very easy to feel. Anybody could actually feel what you're trying to communicate.
Yes. And it's a very, very simple language. For example, the triangle represents the palm and the dot represents the wrist, and the 2 stay together like the eye, the dot and the eye. And the blind person already knows the direction of the hand just from where the dot is in relation to the triangle. So it's very basic shapes that are puzzle-like in a way, and because there are only 13, they can combine to make all the taxi signs.
Susan, moving on, I mean, because we're running out of time, we can actually talk about this forever. There's so much work that you've done, and I mean, it's so remarkable and so progressive. But you're an artist. You've been an artist for a long time. You have some wonderful works. We're particularly interested in where you're going now. I've seen your work in the ABSA building. I mean, it's an incredible piece of sculpture. But you're now working on a huge project that hopefully we're going to capture on tape and explain. It's a fascinating work,
yes.
And it's huge.
Well, it'll hopefully be in maquette form at the moment. And I met Madiba and explained the work to him in the Constitutional Court on exhibition, which was a highlight for me. The Ubuntu sculpture is 11 sculptures that throw a shadow that read Ubuntu every day throughout the year at 10 o'clock in the morning. And my shadow sculptures...
So from different angles, winter, summer, makes no difference?
All the way through, no, the shadow obviously changes depending on how
far
back the sun is. Between
Ubuntu.
10 and 11 it will always read. So it's been worked out by an engineering program. that it actually, the way it's, the footprint of the sculpture is arranged in a way that the shadow will always read Ubuntu. And why it's been interesting, say from the point of view now, is that on my exhibition, which was at WAM for the taxi hand signs for my thesis, I used light and light shapes on the floor of the gallery to represent the blind shapes. And it's the paradox of shadow and light representing something for the blind, but for sighted people to represent the blind, it's a kind of a paradox. And light itself, when it's extreme, is blindness. So I'm playing with shadow, with light, with sightedness, with sighted people being blind, with blind people seeing more than maybe sighted people might see. That's what I'm working on at the moment.
Where will this sculpture eventually be built? Have you decided upon that, or
I've got to find a sponsor.
You're still trying to find a sponsor?
Find
because
a
it's
sponsor.
huge. I mean, how big is it in?
Well, depending on the piece of land, and I want it to be on some very open space where people can walk in the shadow of respect and friendship, which is what Ubuntu means. And hopefully it'll be on a big open space somewhere where people can picnic.
Susan, you're also a granny, a mother, a wife.
Yes.
Have your children and husband, have they all supported you? Are they all behind you in your works?
They've been absolutely amazing, and I honestly don't think that one can take on such an enormous thing like a thesis, especially as an older person. And it's such a privilege to be able to have had the kind of mentors that I had at WITS.
You studied at WITS, obviously.
Yes, it was
in the art department. Yeah.
It was through the anthropology department and through the art department. So I had Professor Eric Warby and Professor David Andrew, and those were my two mentors.
It's been an absolute honor being with you on the couch today. We look forward to seeing Ubuntu in its true form. We also look forward to knowing and watching now. It's going to give me a greater understanding of hand signals when people actually say this. They're going to Dipkloof and so on, and they're going into town or out of town. And that. But it's really, you're a very special person to have dedicated so much to the subject, and also particularly to the blind. You've been on the couch with Susan Woolf and with me, David Shapiro.